Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the continuing story of Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. In these episodes, we have been reviewing the story of the evolution of our waterfront, an absolutely magnificent body of water, first seen, of course, by Spanish explorers who saw the commercial and defense opportunities here. The waterfront, of course, became the site of a Spanish colony in 1698. The holdings here reverted to the French and then the Spanish again and the English, and on through and on into finally in 1821 becoming part of the United States. And in our story, we've told about how this began to, first of all, the waterfront began to be changed through the building of our Navy Yard, and then, of course, in the late 1860s, the coming, first of all, of lumbering, and then of fishing, and then of naval stores, and, of course, along with all of that, the building of railroads, many of those railroads. Now, today we want to wind up our story, we want to kind of focus on more modern times. In the last episode, we talked about how the lumbering industry, of course, finally ended because there were no more trees. And then, of course, the problem of the port itself beginning to decline, how the two major railroads had literally given their facilities to first of all, to the Port Authority, and then, of course, the properties had been claimed by the city of Pensacola itself in 1969. Now, into the 1960s, we face an era, a kind of time of decision. Now, I want to make this point carefully because I'm afraid very few people appreciate it. From the beginning of Pensacola's industrial economic history, the port, the waterfront itself was considered a part of the economy. This was a place where things were made, things were sold, things were shipped. This is where railroads had their termini. This is where the streetcar system ended. Well, everything that had to deal with making money was here. And then, consequently, there were other things associated with it, and no one in this time gave a thought to using the port, commercially at least, as a visitor attraction. To show how this further changed, beginning in the mid-1930s, 1935-36, the city, for the very first time, built two sewage treatment plants, the first that they had ever had to handle all of the collection of sewage within the city. One of these was at the foot of DeVille Street, the other at the foot of 9th Avenue. And those sewage treatment plants served there until the 1960s. By then, the entire county was growing, and there were a great problem was emerging on how to treat sewage. And consequently, a decision was made that to benefit everyone, a new sewage treatment plant using much more modern methods would be built at the foot of DeVille Street. This would be a major plant. The city would close the one on 9th Avenue, and then they would transfer not only all of the local city sewage, but much of the sewage being collected by county-owned plants and others just north of the city. So all of this was the game plan, and in 1964-65, the Main Street sewage treatment plant was built. And again, people at that time said, this is the right place to put it. This is an industrial waterfront. That is our plan. By the time we move into the 1970s, people are beginning to change their thoughts because by now, all of the engine that drove the economy along the waterfront had largely dissipated. The railroads were running, of course, still had operations down there, but they were much, much smaller than they had been. And by this point in time, people across Florida and other parts of the country were saying, well, if you have a beautiful waterfront, use it to attract visitors, to establish a visitor economy. And so people began to think step by step in that way. And as they did, people began to say, well, how can we make this possible? Well, some people with foresight began to say, well, let's take advantage of getting a hold of property and make it look nice. And one of the first to do that was the Gulf Power Company. They acquired a large footage along what we now call Bayfront Parkway. In 1983-84, they built their beautiful new Gulf Power headquarters there with a large landscape, of course, went right down to the water. A beautiful site. This helped to spawn the creation of the new Park Hotel, Grand Hotel, built from the former railroad headquarters. And then other dreamers said, well, now what we need is a driveway so that people coming into the city will get the best possible impression. They'll drive right along the bayfront, see this beautiful bay, and we'll make this a show place as well. And so in stages, Bayfront Parkway came into being. Now we move step by step by step, and people are now beginning to say, now wait a minute, we've got to do more about the environment. The Clean Water and Clean Air Acts had spawned a whole lot of thinking in that way, and people began to say, now what we've got to do is we've got to prevent erosion, we've got to control pollution into the bay, we've got to bring the bay back so that, as the old timers used to say, it is so clear you can see right down to the bottom when the water's 30 feet deep. We've got to bring that back. And so step by step, people began to take actions of that kind. And as we move forward, of course, some of this is part of planning, and the city of Pensacola engaged a number of outside consultants who came in and made studies on what should be done. And some of this was environmentally originated. Some of it was strictly from appearance. And one of the things that many people who live here will recognize that about 10 to 12 years ago, a movement called Green Shores went into operation here, which was intended to put little deposits of rock and other material opposite the shoreline, right at the foot of 17th Avenue, so that erosion would be halted, and that we would begin to purify the water along the bay. And this was step one of what is planned to be a long-term process. Well, as all of this began to take place, people began to look at the port. And some of the critics began to say, well, port used to be fine. It used to employ a lot of people. It made money. But now it's there, and we don't employ as many people as we used to. There aren't as many ships coming and going. Also, and this of course went with the idea of the visitor attraction and putting more residential people close to the water. They began to say some of the things that happen in the port are distasteful. Some of them are noisy. Some of them create dust. Some of them create odors. So we ought to do away with all of that and turn that piece of property, that 50 acres of the port down there, into something more favorable to something other than overseas commerce. And that became a kind of a football beginning in the late 1980s. In 1990, one effort was made by an outside firm to come in and literally buy the port properties to turn it into the site of either condominiums or hotel and a major shopping area, but that was voted down by the city council. About the same time, others began to say, well, now let's look at the residential potential here. We've got Bayfront Parkway. Let's build some nice buildings along there where you can literally live and look out right over the water, and people did. On the other side of town, people said, well, we've got this old Balin Street Wharf, which has sat here for years. When Francis Taylor closed down the fishing operation, the last one in 1965, people began to say, well, how can we better use the Balin Street slip? Well, this went back and forth as a sort of a political football and an economic football for a number of years, but ultimately, step by step, it was created as a wonderful upscale residential area, which we now call Port Royal. And Port Royal covers not only what once was the fishing area, but also a part of the land that was literally created by the dumping of ballast and the creation of sand and rock some 50 years before. All of this is taking place to make change. Now, we have to look again at the story of railroading. I purposely left this out because I think it helps cement the point as we talk about what's going to happen in the future. We talked about the presence there along the waterfront of the Louisville and Nashville or CSX docks. We talked about the arrival of the Pensacola, Alabama, Tennessee, which translated later into the Frisco. And we talked about the Pensacola and Perdido and the little docks that took care of the petroleum importing groups. What we didn't mention before was what might have happened. It might have happened. It never did, but if we had been here all talking in these terms in about the year 1901, we would have probably all been rushing down to Merrill Lynch or someplace to buy stock in a railroad company. Because at that point in time, there were 6 additional railroads chartered which would have begun on the waterfront in Pensacola and moved to some point either north or west. Bear in mind, the city of Pensacola owned all of that property. And every time a railroad came along and wished to begin its operation there, they had to work out either a lease or purchase with the city. And had one or more of those 6 railroads come to pass, we would have had additional railroad piers jutting out into the water somewhere west of DeViller Street. Of course, not one of those 6 ever floated, and that passed away. But it's important for us to realize, as we look at this in the 21st century, how much the focus of attention by all city leaders and the community at large was on Pensacola's waterfront being an economic engine, not some place where we would attract either residents or people coming to enjoy themselves. Well, things move forward. Additional surveys were held. We can't cover them all in an overview like this, but basically one of the most important ones that we had here came right after the Ivan storm of the early part of the 21st century, when a very successful, very famous consultant named Ray Gindros came here from Pittsburgh and did a study of the downtown area and how we could improve both transportation, communication, access back and forth. There were critics of the Gindros study, not of him, but of the fact that when he was given his charge, he was not allowed to cover the entire waterfront, but he was not even supposed to look at the potential for the Port of Pensacola itself. Well, we moved forward from that, and now the city began to look at another operation. The city itself, the city fathers, had built a municipal auditorium for cultural purposes, which came into action, into use here early in the 1950s, and that facility served for half a century. But by the early part of the 21st century, it was old. It was being criticized as not being appropriate for modern day events. And so it was to be torn down, and now the city wanted to replace it. And the plans went forward for a new magnificent facility for cultural arts, and a combination of other things as well, on what had been the property originally owned by the Frisco Railroad, which had been taken over by, or given over for development to the Trillium Company. Now the city decided it would proceed, and the city fathers went forward and paid about $3 million to acquire the Trillium property, which of course they had once owned on their own and kind of let get away. And the plans now went ahead for a magnificent new facility, which we got the nickname of the Trillium facility. Well, this went back and forth. A referendum was taken, and finally the voters felt that was too expensive, and it was rejected. And from that point forward came a new idea, which was to have what we call a maritime park, which would include a whole series of things, a large maritime museum, which would be operated by the university. There would be commercial facilities for visitor residents and for sales of various kinds, and there would also be a baseball park for miscellaneous uses, and then facilities for concerts and other things right on the water. And the Maritime Park Committee was put in place. Monies were appropriated on the open end here, but not totally confirmed. And so discussions proceeded for Maritime Park over the next few years. And so I end my story with that. As I tell this story today, and of course this may change tomorrow afternoon, but Maritime Park is still in the discussion stage. It looks very promising. They have a wonderful committee leading it. We still don't know exactly, however, what will happen or how the financing would fall in place. But remember, all of this wonderful waterfront area which we've had, which was the heart of commerce here for so many years, basically is standing idle today. The port functions, but on a modest basis. There is a new restaurant in place down there, and an engineering firm. We have the Patty fishing establishment down at the foot of A Street. But as we look up and down the waterfront on both sides, things are very different than they were exactly 100 years ago. So next time you drive down Bayfront Park Road, stop at some appropriate place. Stop and close your eyes and envision, if you can, what Pensacola's waterfront looked like in the year 1900 and what it is today, and then say to yourself, what's going to happen tomorrow?